the whole issue about bending the curve wasn't plan A, it was plan B. Plan A is to stop the virus from establishing itself in a country and preventing community transmission. We failed miserably on that. Viruses don't jump. We make them jump. It's what we do. It's not what the bat does. The bat is just a passive carrier. The bat isn't coming to us, we're going to the bat. And so it's our responsibility, our culpability, and as such, our responsibility to change our behavior.
You're not taking into account what people would have died from naturally. I mean, there are some reasonable questions here, are there not?
No, look, what you're talking about is what's the impact of the virus? In the United States, there are 140,000 people that celebrated New Year's this year that are not alive today. And it's safe to say those 140,000 people would still be alive today if it wasn't for that virus.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Dennis Carroll, the American virologist, tropical disease expert, and founder of the Global Virome Project. You starred in the Netflix documentary Pandemic: How to Prevent an Outbreak, which eerily foreshadowed the global coronavirus crisis. Previous to this, you were instrumental in leading the medical response against the H1N1 and bird flu epidemics, and you received the USAID Science and Technology Award for your work fighting malaria and avian influenza. Throughout the global coronavirus pandemic, you have been critical of the lack of government response and leadership while advocating science-based, proactive solutions to this ongoing crisis. Dr. Carroll, welcome to London Real.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you here. You know, before we get started, I just want to announce to everyone that we're streaming now on our new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everybody watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me just repeat that. Can everybody watching us please share this link via the sidebar to all your social media channels? Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. Dennis, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anybody in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv/Carroll. Thanks to the generous donations of over 34,000 people around the world that we affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Dennis, I'm excited to have you here today. I got to ask to start off, I mean, you've been predicting for the past 30 years this, as you say, this zoonotic shift that was outlined in your Netflix documentary. I mean, are the events of this year in some weird way a vindication of sorts for you?
No, it's certainly not a vindication. You know, what it really is, though, it's indicative of a very predictable pattern that it's a bit like weather forecasting. And in many ways, when you think about the emergence of new viral diseases, think of them as the equivalent of the emergence of a hurricane somewhere out over the Atlantic. There are very predictable forces that turn a weather front out over the water into a tropical storm and then into a hurricane. And, you know, we've had 50 years of very good data acquisition and modeling by weather services that have allowed us to be much more precise Still a ways to go, but much more precise about forecasting hurricanes. Thinking about emerging viral diseases is not that dissimilar. There are forces, dynamics, pressures that in fact propel viruses that currently exist, currently circulate in wildlife to jump into people and then move from people to people. And the more we understand those forces and we understand where those forces are playing themselves out most dynamically, then we have a much better ability to focus our efforts in those places, among those species and those practices that drive relatively unknown innocuous viruses today into headlines tomorrow. So unlike hurricanes, we don't really have a chance to prevent hurricanes. We have a chance to use hurricane forecasting to prepare. But better forecasting around the drivers behind emerging diseases really allows us not only to prepare for them, to minimize their impact, but they also allow us to prevent them. The spillover, the movement of viruses from animals into people is very much a consequence of us, the way we live on this planet, our footprint, how we interact with the ecosystems around us. And if we really understood those actions that put us at risk with better granularity, we have a chance to change them. Personal behavioral practices, municipal or industrial level practices, all conspire to make this world a far riskier place today than yesterday. So looking at COVID-19, emergence and spread in the pandemic, it's not a vindication in any way, but it is reflective of what we know, that COVID-19 is not an accident. It's not a black swan event. It is a direct consequences of we as Homo sapiens and how we live on this planet. We can prevent them, but we have to be smart and we have to be diligent. So,
when you filmed this documentary, and I know it was out last year, when did you honestly think there would be an event that would be big enough for the population to say, oh, wow, that's a lot like that documentary I just saw with Dr. Carroll? What did you think it would be? Years, decades?
No, look, when we were filming that documentary, we were also not the documentary people, but work that I was doing, we were tracking and following viruses that we're very concerned about, that have all of the pedigree, if you will, for turning from anonymous into highly impactful. So there are any number of those viruses that we're concerned about. Clearly, coronaviruses, respiratory viruses at large, those viruses that transmit by sneezing and coughing, those are the things we're most concerned about. Vector-borne viruses such as Zika or yellow fever, their ability to move large distances. Those are the viruses that you're really concerned about. Or viruses like HIV that move sort of stealthily, that they infect and are able to transmit from person to person for a decade before you even know, because we watch for illness, and if it doesn't cause an illness, we don't pay attention to it. So it's really a matter of paying attention to the range of potential behaviors out there for viruses, their own dynamics, and customizing the way you think about them to be reflective of what an individual virus might look like. One of the biggest challenges we have is that we're always fighting the last war. After the West Africa Ebola epidemic, every event after that, we mounted a response as if it were the West Africa Ebola epidemic. There was a significant plague outbreak in Madagascar. The first response was as if it were West Africa Ebola. Whenever we have a influenza event, we respond to the next event, a coronavirus, as if it were an influenza. These things have their own character, their own features. And in some way, part of being smart is being able to develop a detailed understanding of the unique features these viruses have, and then be prepared to develop a response that's customized to those specific features. So when we were filming the pandemic series, influenzas were indicative of respiratory viruses. And we know that China, for a variety of reasons, is a cauldron of emerging viral threats, particularly among influenzas and coronaviruses. So that it came out of China, no surprise. That it was a respiratory disease, no surprise. How we responded to it, now that was a shocker.
All right. And I want to get into that for sure. Let's talk about the origin of the virus. I mean, I've been, really lucky to have, 20 or 30 of the top doctors, scientists, Kennedys, Nobel Prize winners, generals to talk about this. I've heard lots of theories, lots of them, from the fact that it was in a lab in North Carolina, shipped off to a Wuhan lab, from things that Dr. Zach Bush has talked about, similar to you, that the environment was so taxed in Wuhan that we would expect it to show up in a place like that. And I've heard everything in between as far as the origin of this. What do you see as the origin of this, and how do you explain it to the layman?
Well, first, what we really need to do is to make sure is to stop speculating what the origin. And what we need to be doing right now with Chinese scientific counterparts is, in an open and transparent way, really drilling down, going back and looking thoughtfully, carefully at the evidence, and let that evidence drive our final conclusion. So there's lots of speculations out there. I have to say most of those speculations are politically tinged. They're more about to make a political point than a public health point. So let's use the moment now, as things have begun quieting down in China, and make sure we do due diligence to really document with evidence what the origin is. So I don't think there's a need to speculate whether it's laboratory-based, man-made, manipulated. We can find out that answer. There's lots of evidence out there that right now tells us very clearly that, first off, it was not a biologically engineered, laboratory biologically engineered virus. It's a natural virus. And there's nothing, again, to indicate that it was an escape virus from a laboratory. What we do know is that its emergence was very, very, very consistent with what we've seen to be a steady stream of emergence of any number of viruses over the years. That is, a virus in a wildlife animal, a bat, that is becomes proximal, close to a human, or to an animal, another animal that will become close to a human. And the natural dynamics of spillover, those we've documented, we see they happen multiple times a year. This is not an unusual event. Its ability to sustain human-human transmission and to cause serious illness, that is unusual. But seeing spillover events over and over and over again in China, across Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, that's a very normal, predictable event. So the weight of experience would say what we see with this virus is absolutely consistent with what we've seen and continue to see with spillover events involving natural dynamics, not man-made or enhanced.
Okay. Does the pollution and sometimes the environmental abuse, kind of ramp up the probability of it occurring in places, in addition to the wildlife and the wet markets?
Well, there are places that we would classify as hotspots that, viruses can circulate anywhere, but where they're most likely to spill over, that's a different story. Where is it that we're likely to see a virus circulating in a wildlife animal spill over into human population? And there's been a lot of work done over the last 20 years, understanding what underlies the spillover event. And it's allowed us to zero in on certain places in the world that we would classify as hotspots. And those are the places you really want to pay attention to. It has the greatest probability, not exclusive. There's always the outlier. But if you really want to understand where it's most likely to occur, follow the evidence that speaks to the underlying drivers for spillover. And I'll give you some examples. First off, you need a place where there is viral diversity. And viral diversity is frequently associated with mammalian diversity. So where you have rich mammalian species diversity, you're likely to find a range of viruses. Secondly, where those mammals that are infected with viruses, the subspecies, there are 5,000 plus mammalian species out there. Which of the species are they all equal in terms of allowing for a spillover event? And what we found, it's really those species that have high interactive engagement with human populations or livestock. Lots of species rarely interact, rarely come close, but there are certain ones, and the thumbnail sort of summary is rats, bats, and non-human primates. Those tend to be most implicated because they tend to have learned how to cohabitate within ecosystems that we occupy. So if you go to those places where viruses are circulating and those species that have high frequency interaction, and that there are population pressures that are driving people or livestock in closer engagement with those populations, then you're most likely to see opportunities for spillover to occur. So, again, the rule of thumb, population pressures, mammalian diversity, high frequency interaction, and where land use change, where we're changing and disrupting the natural ecosystems. So it's those species that we would call generalists, that they have the ability to adapt anywhere, as opposed to those species that have a very narrow habitat range. So as we increase our footprint and induce landscape change, we're really driving forward the influx of generalist species that tend to have high frequency, rats, bats, and non-human primates. London, you would find rats all over the place, right? So
yeah,
they've learned how to live with this.
Does it make it worse when some of those animals are delicacies and it's actually makes it more profitable if I keep them live in a market and I want to eat it? Or is that just a small percentage of how that can occur? I'm talking about bats in like a wet market in Wuhan, where I wouldn't see that necessarily in London. Is that really play a big part, or is that just something as Westerners that we play up too much?
It plays we haven't been able to get the kind of granularity as says what's the relative contribution of this or that. Certainly consumption of bats as a protein source, it may seem bizarre to us, but it's no different in some ways than consuming a turkey. It's an animal, and it provides protein for people. But we also know that bats are places that they occupy places that are also frequented for industrial practices. Bat guano, bat shit, is a major source of nitrogen for a number of different projects. We find them certainly for fertilizer, emulsifiers, and makeup come from bat guano. And so you've got major operations in different regions of the world where people are going into these caves, harvesting bat guano and bringing high exposure. So there's a number of practices that are out there that can bring exposure. This other about the primary reservoir might be a bat, but we saw, let me give you an example, in Malaysia in 1999, an incredibly dangerous pathogen called Nipah virus circulates in bat populations in that region of the world. And there was an extraordinary event where we began seeing a dramatic increase in people who were being infected and dying from the Nipah virus. It's one of the most deadly viruses we have out there. 70% of the people who are infected die. And what we traced it back to was a pig farm, was moved into a jungle area. They knocked down the trees, built an open air pig farm. And the bats that accumulated in the surrounding forests tended to have roost in the enclosed huts of the pigs, and they would hang upside down and drop feces, and they infect the pig. The pig got infected with the Nipah virus, and then the farmers got exposed either through slaughtering. And so it was indicative of how a bat can transfer the virus to another animal, and that animal then becomes, whether it's a pig or a civet cat, as in the case of SARS in 2003. So there are lots of different routes and ways that we can look at the movement directly and indirectly.
Okay. And that scenario you're talking about, I think, was shown in the movie Contagion, right? The very last scene, there was
That's
that
exactly right.
bat to
Anyone who
pig.
wants to get a really graphic illustration, go on to YouTube and type in "end of Contagion." And there is a 1.5-minute clip that walks you through precisely that. And it was absolutely based on that Malaysia model event in 1999. It's evidence, it's a clear example, and the movie does a brilliant job in illustrating how a virus in a bat can end up even in someone like Gwyneth Paltrow.
So I forced myself to watch that movie in March, and it's pretty sobering. This is before we were on lockdown or anything. And of course, I see Gwyneth Paltrow, convulsing on the floor of her kitchen as her children watch her die. So it was a bit ominous, but, I've been told it was a pretty accurate movie, and it was quite accurate, showing the military coming in. And maybe at the end of this conversation, we'll get to the end with their vaccine portrayal as well. This, this friendly nasal saline solution that makes everything 100% better. We'll talk about that maybe at the end. But yeah, no, I was good. People should watch that for sure. Also, bats do harbor a lot of diseases, probably more than turkeys. So, having that human contact is potentially more dangerous.
So you broke up.
Sorry about that. Bats also harbor a lot of diseases themselves. Yeah. And so potentially they are more dangerous than, say, having a turkey around, because they are breeding grounds more so than other animals?
Well, bats are a double-edged sword. They're able to coexist with a broad range of viruses without showing any adverse effect. They aren't adversely affected by carrying these viruses. So on that side, they pose a challenge for us, but they also, as part of the ecosystem, are incredibly important in terms of keeping mosquitoes and other potentially deadly vectors, under control. So, the solution isn't to look at bats as essentially the arch enemy, as the big reservoir of bad things. They also play an incredibly important role in ensuring our own well-being. I think the big issue is this: viruses don't jump. We make them jump. It's what we do. It's not what the bat does. The bat is just a passive carrier. It's how the bat isn't coming to us, we're going to the bat. And so it's our responsibility, our culpability, and as such, our responsibility to change our behaviors, not look at the bat as the arch enemy. Okay. We've seen our enemy, and that enemy is ourselves. It's what we do, how we do it. So take responsibility, own it, and then change it.
Well, let's talk about that. And I definitely think the bats suffer from a PR problem for sure. So we definitely need to get them better representation on Madison Ave, for a lot of reasons. You once said, quote, "To know your enemy is key to victory." And I think you were talking about maybe what you just mentioned, and the fact that we need to look in the mirror and look at population growth, the land use, all the things that we've been doing to facilitate that. Is that what you were talking about, or were you talking about something else?
No, it's basically, I was paraphrasing Lao Tzu, the Chinese general philosopher, who fundamentally said, again, abbreviating, to know your enemy is to be victorious in every battle. To not know your enemy is to lose. And so when we think about emerging viral diseases, the more we know, not just about the viruses and their ecosystems, but what it is that we do that trigger them to move out of that ecosystem into us. So knowledge is power in this case. It gives you insight. And if you use that insight well, your ability to prevent spillover, first off, is fundamental. There's no reason why viruses should jump from wildlife into us. If we managed our footprint on this planet appropriately, these events wouldn't happen. But if we also know where these events are likely to play out, we understand the viruses and their ecosystems, it also allows us to put in place surveillance systems, so that in the case of COVID-19, in all likelihood, COVID-19 didn't spill over in December in Wuhan. It, in all likelihood, spilled over months earlier and circulated and was misidentified as an influenza virus because it came in play during influenza season. And it was only when some very smart clinician found a patient in December and realized it wasn't an influenza, it was something else. The point is that if we had surveillance out there looking for telltale signatures of a spillover event, we would have picked it up in October. We wouldn't have waited till December. So not only can you prevent their spillover, but being smart with your surveillance, you can pick it up immediately and essentially identify it, contain it, and eliminate it. And it never becomes the headline that it is today.
Okay. Let's talk about then the events of the last, I guess, 9 months now. I mean, what do you see as some of the key points of ways we could have prevented or decisions that maybe we can learn from? Because from what I understand of your research, this is something that we should be expecting to happen in some way, shape, or form annually from here out, like hurricanes. So what do you see as some of the things? I mean, I know there was a pivotal decision to allow people to go home for Chinese New Year in December, obviously shutting down airline traffic or not at certain points. What do you see as some of the big benchmarks of this whole crisis?
Well, first off, the big benchmark, it was, I think, underscored by countries like Vietnam and Thailand, which showed that you could control it. These are two countries that are right up against, China. I mean, Thailand is one country removed, but the point is they are immediately vulnerable well before anyone else to these events. And to this day, this very same virus that we're dealing with, they dealt with also. And Vietnam and Thailand together, total population represents half the population in the United States, half of the population in the EU. And they don't have half the mortality that the EU has and half the mortality that the United States have. There's a total number of 58 people who have died in Vietnam and Thailand. And all of those, in fact, are in Thailand. No deaths in Vietnam. There's something they did that showed that this virus was very containable, very controllable, and without destroying their society. And we need to be really clear about that. These are not the most technologically advanced, right? They're not the ones that you would think of as, the leaders in being able to control an event like this. You would think North America and the United States and Europe would have been. The fact of the matter is, Europe and the United States responded equally bad in the beginning, profoundly misread the events playing themselves out in Asia in ways that the Vietnamese and Thais did not. They heard the same messaging coming out of China at the beginning of the new year. They understood that the vulnerabilities about a novel infectious disease, and they took action immediately. They began controlling population movement from China into their countries. And they did the simple stuff that we still have trouble doing: getting people to wear masks, diagnostics, and contact tracing. They did it early, effectively, and sustainably. And you've not seen sustained community-based transmission of this virus in those countries. That's a wildly different situation than what we see in North America, the United States, and Europe. So
not a single death in Vietnam? That sounds suspicious, doesn't it?
No, because there are some really good research facilities there that are working in Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, and they are very clear. They're doing very good case management, trying to identify, and they're not finding any. Now, the numbers themselves aren't perfect numbers, but what you are seeing very clearly is that Vietnam and Thailand are places where sustained community transmission never really took root.
Okay, and that's because they locked down early, which obviously the EU didn't do, America didn't do. America didn't lock the EU down, which hurt it, right? What looks like the strains in the East Coast came from us here in Europe. Also didn't buy into the distancing, to any of the other stuff, and still haven't, I guess. And you're saying these are the reasons, or big reasons why.
Those are the, ultimately, Europe did get its act together. It did not respond, its initial response was very similar to the US response. It, however, had its Saul on the road to Damascus moment where it realized they have to start doing, and they did. The UK was a bit slow in bringing that together. And you ultimately look at the numbers now and, the dramatic sustained reduction in community transmission across Europe at this point, with maybe Sweden being a bit of an exception. In the United States, those we've never embraced politically or culturally. The measures that we know work. We've seen it demonstrated country after country, South Korea, Indonesia, over and over, China, over and over again. This does not demand a high-tech response. It requires a mask, incredibly protective, incredibly protective. We'll be lucky if we get a vaccine that is as protective as a mask.
So I've had experts on that have told me that the virus itself is, multiple orders of magnitude smaller than what a mask can guard against. And so they've gone on to tell me that the mask itself can't block the transmission of that virus, making it pointless. What do they get wrong when they say that, in your opinion? Or what do the masks do? Maybe we should talk about that.
The vast majority of virus that's being transmitted as from coughing and sneezing isn't a free agent. It's not out there as an individual virus. It's trapped in sputum, mucus, globs, and the mask can protect us against those globs. And that's what the vast majority of viruses that we're exposed to are being transmitted in. And they also can end up on surfaces, so that's why good hygiene, constantly using sanitizer, is critically important. And then the issue about social distancing, keeping 6 feet apart, further reduces the opportunity for a cough to propel even a globular encrusted viral agent, directly to you. It'll fall to the ground beforehand. So yes, in a virus, if you look at how big a virus is and then how massive the mesh is, no, the mask wouldn't protect against an individual virus, but individual viruses are rare and far between. It's really, if we're trying to stop the spread of a virus, go after what's the most common form of that virus, and it's largely encased in some kind of mucus, some kind of bodily fluid. That it will trap. That it will protect one against it being expelled if you have a mask on, and if you don't, it protect you from inhaling it. Now you have to wash the mask and handle it carefully. But if both people have a mask on, and this is where you get a powerful multiplier effect. If I'm infected and I cough and sneeze, and you have a mask on, you are not going to get. I'm going to have stopped 99% of anything getting out, and your mask is going to protect against that last percent.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about the reporting of deaths, because it's been very controversial about the accuracy and the qualification of COVID-19 deaths. It became even a meme about a month ago, Doctor, where people were saying that, a husband shot his wife at home because he couldn't stand being around her, and it was because of COVID-19, because they were locked at home. These kinds of things. And so, we saw Italy with all these cases, and then one of the members of parliament came out and said, 99% were comorbidity. And then other people said that wasn't true. We saw aspects in America where we thought people were getting financial benefits for that. And this obviously caused mistrust in the public, which then doesn't help when you ask them to wear masks. What's your stance on all of this? Was it misreported? Was that happening?
No, look, what you're talking about is what's the impact of the virus? And in this case, people with comorbidity, what was the probability of their dying? And this is only, in the last 5 months, what's the probability of their dying from that comorbidity? What's the probability of their dying because they're over 60 years old? And the missing ingredient in this equation is the virus. The virus, in the United States, there are 140,000 people that celebrated New Year's this year that are not alive today. And it's safe to say those 140,000 people, with fine tuning a few here and there, would still be alive today if it wasn't for that virus. That's fundamentally what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is and isn't. It's just some people have said, an autopsy report, I've been forced to put COVID-19. I never had to do that before. I just talked about what they died from. Other people say you're not taking into account what people would have died from naturally. Trump was on last night saying that the median age was 78. And maybe we can get into the ramifications of the lockdown on the back of that. I mean, there are some reasonable questions here, are there not?
No, I don't. Look, what we're talking about, what is the impact of a virus on public health? And as I said, there are 140,000 people that are dead that are attributed to this virus in the United States. You could go through all of those and sort out how many of those would have died if the virus hadn't been around. And it'll be a very small fraction. There may be a relative handful, but then there are lots of people who died. Remember, you're only making the attribution of a COVID-19 death if what you've done is confirm they had COVID-19. There are lots of people who are dying who, in fact, have not had a COVID-19 test, and they may have died from COVID-19, but because they didn't get a test, it will not be attributed to COVID-19.
Yeah, well, some were being attributed without even a test, I was told. But let me ask you another question.
I think that's part of the problem, is that there's a lack of uniformity in how the numbers are counted. And I think that's part of the chaos that, we've seen the absolute lack of singularity in the response to this virus. And among those lack of singularity is having a clear case definition that becomes uniformly and universally applied. And we don't have that. So we're comparing apples and oranges. But if people want to use that argument to say that this virus is less deadly than it is, that's a misinterpretation, because you're losing both because of this lack of uniformity. There are people who did die because of this COVID-19 that are not attributable because they didn't get a diagnostic. And then there are people who died from this virus, who are attributing to COVID-19, even though they may have been in the final stage of cancer, and it pushed them over the edge. So all of these things, and fundamentally, I think people are focusing on arguing on the edges of the issue, as opposed to the fundamental issue is that there are people dead today who never should have died because of this virus. That you have 58 people in Southeast Asia and 140,000 in the United States. It's inexcusable.
It's just still strange to believe. But also the test itself is flawed. I mean, there are false positives and false negatives even in the test itself. Well,
again, that's one of the remarkable failures, and quite frankly, the few number of tests that are actually available. It's really quite extraordinary that this far into a pandemic, that two things. We have the technological limitations to testing that we do have. People will wait a week in order to get their results back. We don't have a point of capture diagnostic, essentially a rapid diagnostic, that there wasn't a significant pool of resources put out on the table for industry to essentially give us the equivalent of an early pregnancy testing capability. If there were billions of dollars put out there, we've already spent multiple trillions of dollars as a consequence to this virus, that we haven't been smart enough to really energize and focus industry to give us a home-based, easily used technology that would allow everyone to know whether or not they're infected or not, is really quite profoundly inexcusable. And then the issue with the quality of the tests is really quite extraordinary. Yes, false positives, false negatives. We have a really difficult time answering the question. Are people reinfected after they've survived a first infection? We're finding lots of examples of people that are showing positive after they've presumably been cleared of this virus, but we don't know whether that's a testing problem, that they really weren't cleared, that there was still virus there. So we have the technologic capability. What we don't have are the incentives to drive the availability of this kind of technology so we get clear, unambiguous, and rapid determination. And this becomes even more complicated when you think there's estimates now that 30 to 40% of the transmission of this virus is attributable to people without symptoms. So, not knowing that you are infected, but you are, and you're transmitting this virus, that you don't know that, or the person you're sitting across from is infected and transmitting the virus. And at this point in time that we lack that information and we lack the technology to be able to rapidly get answers to that is, I just find extraordinary. That we could have had a quote unquote, a Manhattan-like effort to generate this technology and have it widely available. And we're going to still need it over the course of the next year or two. The vaccine is not going to get us out of the woods.
And let me ask you, whose fault is that? I mean, a lot of people point to Trump, the federal government, but it's also states' responsibility to also prepare for this? Or is everyone at fault?
Well, states have a responsibility to prepare, but look, think of a virus as essentially the equivalent of a foreign adversary. And what we don't in the United States, we do not look to each state to develop a militia to respond to a foreign adversary. What we look at is the federal government to develop a national capability and to trigger national leadership and national resources to deal with a national threat. Viruses are no different. Viruses are equivalent to a foreign adversary, and leaving it up to each state to make it up leaves every next state vulnerable to the mishaps of the state next to them. It's a national event, a national threat. We have to stop thinking of it as a threat that's only the responsibility of that given state. And I would expand that in a region like Europe, that it should not be each state unto itself. Italy competing against Germany to get personal protective equipment. It's a regional problem. And when you at least have a regional organization like the European Union, then they did not mount a equivalent of a federal response. Every state was left up to its own. And as such, we saw gross inequities in terms of how people got access and availability, and the response was hugely uneven. Compare the United Kingdom to Germany. So it's a real issue. Viruses need to be treated as a global event, a health and economic event that requires a global coordinated response.
Yeah, when you have fear in there, everything kind of breaks down. I mean, especially in the States. I mean, the states a lot of times want their own sovereignty. And then in Europe, you have the European Union, but as we can see, it only functions for certain reasons at this point.
But I don't think, states weren't arguing for their states' rights in this case. You had state after state after state imploring the federal government to step forward and provide leadership, to ensure that there's a national PPE stockpile, that there's a national stockpile for respirators, as opposed to states having to compete against.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.